Hey, so why do they dress like that in Pokemon? You know what I mean, even if you can't put it into words. People in Pokemon dress like the avatar just discovered Y2K fashion. They look like an entomologist trying to develop a clown sona, like an Olympic athlete doing drag in Brooklyn for the first time. None of that is an insult, by the way. When Pokemon character design works, it creates that iconic je ne sais quoi that we expect from this world's inhabitants. When it doesn't work, well, we'll get to that. So what's the formula for dressing like a Pokemon character? Why in the last 25 plus years did the franchise's fashion sense go from here to here? And most importantly, how can I make clothes that look like that, actually? You already know this isn't a thought experiment. I'm Lizardly and I'm building my own Pokemon original design. For me, it can't be a je ne sais quoi. I need to say quoi very specifically. I need to answer these questions so I can actively apply the answers to the things I am actively sewing right now and finish the outfit portion of this costume. So that's what we're doing today. Not just analyzing the fashion of Pokemon character design and not just sewing our own take on it. We're doing all of the above. Welcome back, beloveds, to the Lavender Town Witch series. Here's what you need to know before I start waxing poetic about Wallace's Oras redesign.
Hi, gay!
This is the costume rendering I drew back in November of 2022. By now, most of you know the idea was, what if Lavender Town had a witch? Lavender Town being the small town in the very first Pokemon game and anime where the player encounters ghost Pokemon and a memorial site for the departed and some famously uncanny music. People made fake creepypastas about this music. The true story, when I was a child, I would boot up my copy of the game and go to Lavender Town just to listen to the music on repeat while I was reading or playing something else just because I really liked it. So many things are wrong with me. My goal here was to take that Pokemon stink we're going to be exploring today and combine it with homespun cottage magic vibes and a lot of historical influence from the 1890s and Edwardian era. If you watched the earlier videos in this series, you know those mostly focused on those latter influences. We've talked a lot about historical construction techniques and we made a cool glowing witch hat. I've got a Pinterest board to keep track of all those different influences, but at this point it is embarrassingly disorganized. I do not recommend the single stream dumpster approach. This rendering is meant to be a jumping off point. I am not a great visual artist and I'm cool with that. One of the first things in a look that makes me think Pokemon is an egregiously high number of accessories. We've got gloves, we've got a necktie, we've got a shawl. These are all on our crafting to-do list for today. And honestly, I might add even more stuff. The shirtwaist is our biggest single to-do, and that is what we're gonna start with. Shirtwaist just refers to this specific style of top that was really popular at the turn of the century. I think of them as being less structured than a bodice. They usually have some kind of gathering or tucking around the waist, so it's time for me to jump you all the way back to the start of this build when I was making a mock-up for exactly that. I just finished my first few trips to the garment district to get stuff like trim and buttons. I was riding the high of finding the perfect periwinkle linen that I'm going to tell you all about soon. But real quick, because I see some of you typing in the comments, at the end of Pokemon Red and Blue, you head to the Indigo Plateau and face off against the Elite Four. There's Lorelei, Bruno, Lance, and Agatha. Agatha, who's one of the only dedicated ghost-type trainers in the first game. Like a lot of Gen 1 characters, her core design is fairly simple, so I used that rough outline of a purple outfit, an apron, a staff. As a starting point, I could transform into something more complex for this project. The crone vibes are on purpose. The witch I'm designing is more of a Yubaba than a Kiki. Remember all of this as we time travel back to 2022, when I'm just about done with my very first mock-up and I'm about to get in the weeds of pattern making. A mock-up is basically making like a practice version of whatever you're building. In this case, it's sewing out of material that you just don't care as much about. I usually just make mine out of muslin because I keep that on hand. It's like $2 a yard, so I can really just do whatever I want with it. And my mock-ups are always like nasty. They're just nasty boys. They're full of Sharpie marks, but they get the job done. This one is a combination of a few different patterns. I started with the pattern I drafted for my Ianthe shirt, and then I took a standard puff sleeve pattern and I just kind of extended it to make it a little bit longer. And I draft a little curvy cuff based on my, measurements here. I would say that specifically the torso of this pattern is very directly 1890s. The shoulder seams slope a little bit towards the back instead of just laying completely flat on top. The front has a little bit of like curved fullness that I'm gonna pleat or gather down, but then the sleeves are kind of just bullshit fantasy sleeves. They're made up. They're definitely not what anyone was wearing in the 1890s. I think they almost look like Gunny Sax sleeves. Like they kind of look like the 1970s take on like prairie homestead fashion. Why not combine 1890s and 1970s? Like, let's fucking go. Last night I seam ripped the mock-up and I transferred everything onto pattern paper because I know the fabric I'm using is a really, really loose weave, so it's gonna be extra important to make sure that absolutely everything is cut as close to the perfect grain line as humanly possible. Also, I just love putting things in my pattern binder. It makes me feel like the freshest and most organized third grader. And I am so excited to get started with this fabric. It is so fucking cool. Can't remember which one is warp and which one is weft, but on one of those it's like a light purple fiber, and on the other one it's a very neutral tan. And I'm always a sucker for a woven fabric where like the pattern, in this case it's a stripe, is woven into it instead of like printed onto it. So next up for today is taking that really cool fabric and cutting it up. I'm definitely gonna have to add some pattern pieces of like lightweight muslin just to interface things like the cuff. Okay, and you guys always ask about the thread pulling method that I use, and I'm gonna try and actually explain it well this time. So when I'm cutting fabric on a very, very loose weave and I really want to make sure that the grain line is like perfect, I will take a seam ripper and I will pull out a single thread from the fabric. That empty space, if it's a really loose weave of fabric, then creates a line that I can just cut along. I can tape it down like along my cutting board and make absolutely sure that it's like perfectly perpendicular. I've got my lawful sewing pants on today. I know sometimes the internet really prefers like, whoa, so chaotic, what am I even doing crafting? And I'm like, I don't know, I hope you guys can still accept me even though I'm sometimes a very lawful crafter. Okay, let's see what bounties my lawful pants will bring us. Speaking of my lawful pants, let's lay down some ground rules for digging into Pokemon character design. I'm generally going to be sticking to the core game series for this discussion. You probably already know I just finished rewatching the first 80-ish episodes of the anime for the previous video in this series, where I made the Pokeball skirt. I served my definitive, unassailable episode ranking too. But there are almost 1,300 episodes in the anime, and there's literally no way. There's just no fucking way. And besides, I think the games are actually more interesting because of their constraints. In an animated scene, Ash, Misty, and Brock can toss on raincoats, or Team Rocket can cosplay every profession known to man, and that's not going to change a whole lot about the show's production. The show most commonly reuses animated sequences, like Ash turning his hat backwards when he needs to lock in. He's going sport mode. Bro, me too. But video games need the design visuals themselves to be reusable for multiple encounters, to maximize limited storage and optimize performance. They can't give every individual Team Rocket grunt a cool spiky hairstyle. In the first two games, they didn't even give you gender options for your player character. So let's start there, with the player characters of Pokemon, the little dude that you're piloting around the world. To me, their journey from 1996 to 2022 is the perfect case study illustrating the real-world passage of time and its impact on the fashion in these games. Pokemon was always meant to depict a near-future setting where the technology is just slightly ahead of our own. If you want to really go deep on the history of retrofuturism in fashion, Nicole Rudolph has a terrific video on this. She goes way further in the Wayback Machine than the mid-90s. The early generations have a strong athletic wear flavor, which absolutely squares with the rising ubiquity of sports culture and sports merchandising in the late 90s. It's in Gen 3 that we first start to see what I consider the hallmark of Pokemon design, the Pokeball silhouette. They figured out the shorthand and they just never let it go. That outline is everywhere. This is also where we start to see all the accessorizing I talked about earlier. You need a bag, you need a hat, you need a scarf if you're in Gen 4 because there's some snowy routes. Generation 6 was the first time we could customize our player characters. You could change their appearance and their outfit, including all those accessories. Fun fact about me, I was still a girl when this game came out, so to me this is still peak girl fashion. This fucking millennial ass outfit with the Peter Pan collar and the high-waisted skirt. I wore that shit every day in the early 20-teens. The gender binary of Pokemon character design is so strong. Like, boy and girl are completely separate categories and there's no mixing in between them. Back in 2019, my friend Mark and I decided to design our own Pokemon player characters for a convention called Holiday Matsuri, where cosplayers often bring festive holiday redesigns of characters. We hopped on a screen share Discord call and co-designed boy and girl flavors of Christmassy player characters, using pretty much all of the design language mentioned so far. We had a lot of laughs as trans people making these costumes, and it was so fun for people at the con to recognize that we were Pokemon trainers even though these designs were not from any specific game. Generations 7 through 9 are interesting because this is where the games started to get really experimental with location, to mixed results. The Alola characters definitely give Pokemon in Hawaii, and the Galar characters give United Kingdom. But Paldea is to me unequivocally the worst decision the franchise has made with player characters in giving us school uniforms that we can only accessorize. Disappointment is an understatement. I've actually been playing through Pokemon Violet as I work on this cosplay, and it's a big part of why I wanted to make this video. It's reductive and boring to throw any of these generations in an irredeemable garbage category, but these designs suck. And I like shorts. They're comfy and easy to wear. Yeah, that's right, I'm not afraid to take a stance here on youtube.com. I like shorts. They're comfy and easy to wear. But let's see how my past self is holding up way back when, a long time ago before it was shorts season and before I had finished bringing those shirtwaist sleeves together. I just got off of my crafting stream, so this is like a little recap moment. I wanted to get started on the cuffs because I think they're fun and they should come together pretty fast. I was aiming to have these really high contrast black, like cartoony stripes going along the cuff, but I wasn't sure what size stripe I wanted to make. So when I went shopping, I grabbed twill tape and satin ribbon in different widths, and I was like, oh, I'll just figure it out later. And I'm glad I did that because it turns out the I'll figure it out later is I'm gonna use both of them. And I'm kind of obsessed with the way these pop against the really light toned fabric. Also, my pro strat for laying down these kinds of flat decorative trims is to use quilting spray instead of pins. When you're using pins on trim like this, the slight little turn of cloth as the metal goes in and out of the fabric can be enough to make some weird tension and some bunching. I'm sure you've seen it if you've tried doing this before. My next step sometime in the next few days is going to be drafting the top part of the cuff here, because I know I want to have some black fabric to make the dividing line between the two pieces of the sleeve be a little bit more concrete. It's a pretty simple thing to trace, so I just pop that on with the raw edge tucked under, and then I can start to bring these tight little tubes together. And I will take a second to brag here because look at this seam when I stitched the cuff together. Drink this in. The hilarious thing is that I just redid these stickers on my machine, and this is the very first thing that I sewed when I had a blessed seam sticker on my machine. Does this sticker have supernatural abilities to bless your sewing? Scientists are baffled, especially because that seam is going away forever now. No one will ever see it again. I really want these cuffs to not have visible seams, so that means I'm basting on one last piece of twill tape, and then I'm going back over that twill tape with 2 rows of stitches along the edge. The curve on these is so tight that it will actually gap if I don't stitch them down on either end, even though the twill tape is like this wide. So then it's time to sew in the lining version I made of this without the muslin backing or any of the decoration and give them a flip. This is pretty much the last thing I need to do on the cuffs before attaching them to the actual shirt, which is something we should talk about. So far for the shirt itself, I have just done the shoulder seams and the side seams. And before I get to the sleeves themselves, I am popping on a quick little 2-inch strip of a button front. This part of the shirt's gonna need some extra stability with all the buttons, and honestly, I am living for this top stitching on this rectangle. I am letting myself enjoy this because I know the curves of inserting those sleeves is gonna be a fucking time, my dudes. But honestly, there's lots of things I hate more than curved seams, things like truth and love. I've got to denounce the evils of them and also extend my reach to the stars above. Let's talk about making enemies. There's a much bigger and gayer video about Jesse, James, and Meowth that is coming up soon in this series, but we do need to talk about the Team Rocket you meet in the game, and the other 8 enemy teams you face off against. And a disclosure before we go any further, I have personally played the first Pokemon game as a child, that's what inspired this costume, and I have played Pokemon X, Moon, Sword, and Violet. I have not personally played Generations 2 through 5 of this series. So obviously I researched these games and these characters to talk about them, but I just want to let you know that Johto to Unova is new territory for me. Looking at these designs, my main takeaway is that if you want to do evil, you need a vectorized logo and color blocking. That's it, that's all you need. A cricket machine is the only thing standing between you and building your own empire of crime. I also can't help but notice that these designs are significantly less gendered than our player characters. The difference between male and female grunts is across the board less pronounced, obviously because in gameplay it matters more that you can identify them as bad guys before you clock any other identifiers. But it does create this funny gender trinary of like boy, girl, evil. It's like when people try to be inclusive of trans and non-binary people, but instead just end up shunting us all into a separate third box, only this time the box is labeled villain. But also, let's be real, the bad guys of Pokemon vary wildly in how bad they are. Team Rocket had some serious teeth. They benefited from something we talked about in the previous video, that Kanto's role as the first region gave its institutions a unique sense of scale. The game doesn't need to get too specific defining what genre of evil Team Rocket is, because they just encompass the scope of everything evil happening. Other generations can't get away with this, which isn't always a problem. Team Skull is deservedly beloved for their comedically ineffective attempts at misdeeds, but then sometimes you end up with Team Yell, who aren't scary and aren't funny and aren't interesting. But even worse, sometimes an enemy team will have genuinely cool motivations and wear the stupidest outfits I can imagine. I'm talking about Team Galactic and Team Plasma. To be honest, I think these enemy team designs typify and represent the signature crime of Pokemon fashion design on both ends of the spectrum. Team Rocket's design in the first game is so simple, you can barely call it a design. And the Team Star bosses in the latest game look fucking absurd. What are they wearing? I would like to coin a phrase to describe this effect. I would like to call this flamboyance drift. Over the last 25 years, the designs for every aspect of this franchise, not just the fashion, has gotten more and more outrageous. And I don't think this is unavoidable. There are plenty of children's franchises that have run for this long or longer without this happening. I will never miss an opportunity to dunk on these guys. So why does this happen? Why did we get in this gradual boiling pot of water that looks like exponential escalation when you zoom out? There are a few specific things that I think explain how we ended up at Swordbird and Shieldword, and I'm gonna get into those after we get a little further on crafting. But before we move away from these guys, a moment for the massive glow up some of them got. Many of the mainline Pokemon games got remakes or sequels at some point along the line, and with that, redesigns. Having spent dozens of hours now looking at Pokemon character art, I think the Team Aqua and Team Magma glow-ups are next level. They turned these men out. Do feel free to fight to the death in my comments about which game from Gens 2 through 5 I should play first. I want to play them, there's just only so many hours in the day. But speaking of hours in the day, let's get back to those sleeves I was cooking up and see if we can pull the shirtwaist all the way together. So the cuff portion of the sleeve is pretty much done. We do need to figure out the big honkin' situation up here. So I've already got the top part sewed into a cylinder with our good old friend French seams. And to gather it into the cuff, I'm just doing a zigzag stitch and pulling on the thread because it's not long enough to warrant needing to use the cord and everything. Then I'm whip stitching down the lining part of the cuff, so this way there won't be any raw or unfinished edges inside of the garment. And I gotta be so real, I am obsessed with this hand sewing. The way that this thread just completely disappears into like the cuff itself is so delicious and so tasty. I really like that the stitches are visible because it reminds me of how in historical garments a lot of the time they would let seams be really visible for any alterations or mending that would ever need to happen. I mean, I'm not planning on having any major alterations happen for the cuffs, but it just looks nice. This level of internal finishing is, I don't know, it makes the horrors worth it, you know? So as of right now, we have finished making these beautiful turkey legs. I just need to pop them into the torso. I tried to baste along the arm side before I inserted the sleeves, because I know with fabric that's this loose of a weave, it might stretch and warp a little bit on something that's very circular like an armhole, but trying to do it with a machine was a massive fuck up. It turned out horrible. So I gave it another shot doing some hand basting, and if you're watching this video in the full playlist of all of these videos, chronologically for me the crafter, this is where my hand basting horse started. Is there a market for hand basting horse merch? I don't know, but I was on a lot of it for this project. For the finishing, I just did a zigzag stitch over the raw edge and tacked that down to get a little top stitching along the arm side. That means pretty much the last thing we need to figure out here is the collar, which I didn't do in the mock-up because I just didn't feel like it and I figured I would face it later. And that absolute last crunch of getting the shirt waist just wearable was crunchy because I wanted to finish this before the month of December 2022, a month that was some time ago. So to be honest with you, I didn't film any of the collar process. I don't know why I did that, but I got a collar in. The button front is still empty, so at this point I'm sewing on some buttons and I'm hand sewing snaps along the front. This way I can have the aesthetic of a row of teeny tiny pewter buttons down the front without actually needing to do, 24 teeny tiny buttons every time I take the shirt off and on. I did hunt high and low in Pacific trimming to find the tiniest buttons that still had some Pokeball energy, and that version of the shirt is the version you saw at the very end of the video about how I made the hat for this cosplay. It was not finished, but it was wearable. Eventually, in the spring, I went back and did hand sew the pleats in the front of the shirtwaist so that it wasn't just stuffed in the waistband like it was earlier, and that is the version of the shirt that you see at the very end of the video about me making the skirt, and also the version that I wore to Katsucon. Katsucon has come up a few times in these videos. You don't really need to pay too close attention to it. All you need to know is that is a convention that I was using as my external deadline to try and get that done. We missed that deadline in 2023, but we made it across the finish line in 2024. So here is the 85% completed shirtwaist. There is so much that I deeply love about her. I think she's beautiful, but there's just one or two little fit issues I want to adjust. You can maybe see if you look closely that the bottom is still just a raw edge. I definitely need to turn and flip that. One of the front tucks here just isn't quite on the correct grain line, and you can maybe tell from the way I'm holding it here, I think the puff sleeves ended up having too much fullness on the inside and front, and I'd like to see if I can just quickly redraft that and take out a little bit of length. Those are all pretty boring changes, but some of you guys are freaks like me and you like the boring shit. So I'm gonna do a smash cut. After all that boring sewing, here's our 1.0 version, 1.5 I guess. TikTok transition, let's go! Nailed it. What a smooth transition that was. I think you can tell how much better the sleeves lay just looking at it on the hanger. Also, I'm a little astonished how much just turning that raw hem made this feel more finished. I just did a teeny tiny rolled hem, tacked it in place, and stitched it down. And you might notice something else is different about this shirtwaist. I didn't mention it before because I didn't want you to be disappointed if it ended up not working out for some reason, but taking apart these sleeves meant I got another chance to revisit the cuff detailing, and I added just a few more little stripes. I tried embroidering this with the backstitch since that's what I used for the Pokeball details on the skirt, but the weave of this linen is just too loose and it didn't work out. So I ripped out my attempt and I whipped out a literal Sharpie. I might do a little weathering later, but otherwise the shirtwaist is finally complete. I genuinely feel like making all those fixes was the last, like, low-key tedious sewing thing I had to get done, and now I can focus on the reason we're here. I can actually put into practice all of the stuff we've been talking about as far as bringing the Pokemon fashion design influence and combining it with all of my other references. But to be so real, as we move on to this next phase of the project, I don't think my dumpster fire Pinterest board is gonna cut it anymore to get myself organized. So buckle up, babes, because we're downloading Milanote. I love building organizational systems like this, and Milanote specifically is a really flexible tool, which is great since we're at such a flexible part of this project, figuring out tangible steps forward. And yes, Milanote was kind enough to sponsor this video, but I want to shoot straight with you that I'm about to use it to do some real-ass organization right now, for the rest of this video and future videos. You will genuinely be missing out on information if you skip ahead, so I would stick around if I were you. The template options are tempting me, but I think I want to get a feel for the system first by starting from scratch. My initial design rendering has to be the centerpiece of all of this as a jumping off point. The point of Milanote is that you can just drag and drop elements in a really open-ended way, so I'm just jumping in without overthinking it too much. Now I want to make a subboard for each part of the project that's still ahead of us because I love taxonomies. The outfit is going to be our main board for this video and cover our immediate crafting goals. Got a board for the glowing staff. Yeah, I haven't talked about that one yet, huh? Board for the prop accessories like the little pokeballs in our drawing. Now that cowboy hat has me in a chokehold. I gotta see what other icons they have for these boards. The prop accessories will involve some repurposed Game Boy hardware, so that feels right actually. I've had a lot of cosplay photographer friends send me their Milanote boards ahead of photo shoots so we can get on the same page, and they always use the color grab tool for visualizing, so I'm definitely gonna pull some swatches from my rendering. The color scheme for this cosplay is very directly inspired by the original Ghost trio, and the way they're all different shades of grayish purple, pop of coral red in the mouth for Ghastly and Haunter, and the eyes for Gengar. And you know what? I'm gonna add the Lavender Town theme MP3 in there, because that's important to the vibes for me. I'm gonna loop it and autoplay it, because Milanote has the power. Now I could use the built-in text header, but I spent $30 American on the exact font they used for the title cards in the Pokemon anime so that I could make graphics with it. It is the stupidest thing by far I have bought for this project, and I need to get more use out of it to justify the purchase. Thank you, Milanote, for supporting PNG transparency. And you know, thank you, Milanote, for being free. To underline that, one PNG cost me $30, but Milanote is free with no time limit. I'm gonna distract myself from font splurges by using the drawing feature to doodle an inhuman amount of sparkles on here. You can draw directly on the board in Milanote, which is power I personally can't be trusted with. I will use the feature for evil. Obsessed with this home base. For our subboards, I'm gonna start with the hat for fun since that's already finished. This time I'm gonna use a template. Let's just grab the mood board template to get started. Since I've got a lot of stuff to pull in from that really disorganized Pinterest, I installed the Milanote web clipper in Firefox. When it's running, I can just yoink the images directly into Milanote instead of right-clicking and save asing. And when I get back in the app, they're all waiting in that little sidebar. And I can start building out this page for the costume's iconic witch hat. There is one part of this project that has intimidated me so much that I have kept secret for over a year, unless you're on my Patreon. I'm making a glowing Gengar staff, and the next long-form video in this series is going to cover that whole process. It's gonna have wood grain texture and use some Warbler crystal art, all images I'm pulling in here. It also needs to come apart to fit in my suitcase. I'm very excited for this and also genuinely terrified. Moving over to the accessories mood board, I cannot wait to talk more about these tiny Easter egg props coming up after that. Also shout out to the Milanote web clipper for keeping the URL source in the caption for these images. I recognized Cosplay Cyanide's Howl Chatelaine, and I love how easy it is to toggle off and on and get back to her original post from here. Now I'm going to use the fashion design mood board for the apron. This project I'm still at a really early stage of ideation on, so I'm just focusing on getting my inspiration all in one spot. And with that, we can wrap up our pie-in-the-sky future planning. Now we gotta lock in and figure out today's objectives for the rest of this fashion design. Starting with the craft project plan template, I'm gonna write a few sentences of like an elevator pitch for this project, and since I want to be able to look at the combination of Pokemon character art and historical references references, I'm gonna make one final mood board. This time I'm grabbing all my favorite Edwardian and 1890s references, the best aesthetic witchy pics I've got saved, and arranging it in a way that'll guide me. I'm seeing the vision, the mood has been boarded. Zooming back out, let's actually put a recent video of the first time I tried on the finished skirt with the shirtwaist. There are 3 items I know I need to cover ASAP, which is the wrist warmers, the necktie, and the shawl. Wrist warmers can't really be broken down much further than finding a pattern and crocheting them. I don't have the fabric for the necktie yet, but I think I can plan out the order of operations for that pretty easily. Now the shawl is a lot more up in the air, but I think I'm just gonna keep it really simple to start and make an embellishment game plan later. And actually, do you guys know what a pince is? The idea came to me a few weeks ago. A pince is like a vintage kind of eyewear that rests on the bridge of the nose. I've been trawling eBay and Etsy to try and find one for this cosplay. We'll see if I manage to track one down. Let's get some notes in here. I was originally gonna reuse wrist warmers from another cosplay, but when I tried them on with the shirtwaist, it kind of broke the line of the wrist. So I definitely want to make something daintier. The necktie is going to be our break in the monochromatic scheme of this cosplay, and I'd love to find a fabric that is interesting enough on its own that it doesn't need additional details painted or embroidered. The shawl is super up in the air right now. I really don't know what kind of embellishment technique I'm going to work with. So actually, let me turn this subboard here into a home base for any tutorials I'll end up using later on. I always need to reteach myself crochet stitches when I start a new project. Okay, I've got a way clearer sense of my next steps, and honestly a really motivating workplace that I'm excited to keep adding to. Milanote is available for free with no time limit. Sign up today using the link in the description and jump into your next creative project and help support this channel. Thank you so much again to Milanote for sponsoring this video. I'm gonna jump us back to Lizard, who's reporting live from the crochet trenches. Hey, it's me from the past and or future, because I'm not really sure where I'm gonna put this part in the edit. When I designed this costume, I thought that I was going to be reusing some wrist warmers that I already had from a cosplay a few years ago. But then over the summer, I did learn how to crochet. And you know, what's the point of learning a new skill if you're not going to insert it into every other project you're doing? I once more headed to Etsy and found a really quick and easy tutorial for some wrist warmers. These are basically just tubes made out of half double crochet. I actually did get started on these while I was playing D&D to have something to do with my hands. Right now, it is about a week before Katsucon. You can tell because I just re-dyed my hair, and I always do that a week before the convention, so this happens now and not when I'm at the con. And I've actually already got one of these done. Let me give a little show and tell moment. Look at that, I made that. The finished version isn't just going to be a tube, it is going to have a little gather here. And once I finish these two, I'm going to make a little half double crochet circle to pop on there. Every single time I get to the end of a row and I count my stitches and it's exactly the number, I'm like, wow, I feel like a genius. I feel like a multi-hyphenate visionary. I'm gonna get this done. I did in fact get these wrist warmers done in time for Katsucon. This was my second ever crochet project. I think they look super cute. After Katsucon, I did go back and shift the placement of the gather slightly to center it better on the back of my hand. And listen, I had been worried that making the half double crochet circle look exactly like a Pokeball would be too on the nose. But after Katsucon, I decided that I was willing to take that risk. There were so many options for how I could achieve this Pokeball shape outline, and after literally so much trial and error, I fully just used a black Sharpie to color it in. My past self was so wrong about this being too on the nose. The Pokeball design is the perfect level of detail. To me, this final evolution form of these wrist warmers is the perfect encapsulation of everything I want this cosplay to be. So I think it's time to talk about the necktie. I've made a lot of cosplay bow ties in my day, and I really want this one to mimic the neckwear that a lot of the girly pop trainer classes can have in the game design. Like we talked about before, this is going to be our little pop of whimsy in an otherwise very spooky ensemble. The fabric I used to make it needs to be a reference of some kind, but I did not know what reference. I knew my search was over when I stumbled on this brocade in Prime Fabrics. It's a silk, it's the perfect shade of that like bright coral red, and the woven grid pattern that almost makes it look checked reminds me of the layout in the Pokemon Tower. To me, this geometric pattern feels very reminiscent of the graphics of Pokemon Red and Blue. Because it was a silk brocade, it was a silk brocade prices, but I think it was completely worth it. Usually when I make neckwear for cosplay, I make it more like a costume, like, just realized I can show you, hang on. It is kind of buried. So for stuff like this, I usually make the bow and then I make a strap and have it attached with a snap. Kind of matches my shirt, huh? But because I was doing so much research into historical costuming and shirtwaists and collars and the silhouettes, I kind of realized that I would get the look I wanted better if I just made a functional necktie or ascot. So I googled around and found tutorials of how to tie an ascot in a bow, and luckily there are a million free patterns for a quick, easy ascot. And to be so for real with you right now, all of those decisions and pattern making was happening 48 hours before I left for Katsucon. So I made this ascot in like 2 hours. It was wearable. It was not much more than that. I've got her right here. It might be hard to tell, but the points that I drafted are not symmetrical on either side. The pleats are like really, really nasty. And you know what, man? I have a whole yard of this beautiful fabric. The ascot is like a 6-inch strip of fabric. Fuck it, I just remade it last night. No one will ever be able to dunk on me harder than I dunk on myself for my excessive hand basting. Yeah, I did 3 separate rows of basting on each of these 3 pleats to make sure that I was accounting for the turn of cloth. And when I was done, did that account for the majority of the crafting time on what was essentially a fabric rectangle with pointy ends? Yeah. But is anyone gonna argue with this end result? Like, look at this. Checkmate, atheists. I do still need to weather this one. I experimented with the idea of embroidery or any painting, and ultimately, I think this fabric is just so beautiful. It just doesn't need any more detail. The only thing I'm gonna do is go in with a little bit of Dynaflow in either black or the ecru I've been using to give a little bit of depth around the edges. I'm hoping to get that wrapped up today. So wait, I've talked about girly pop trainers, but who is she? There's one last category of NPC we need to talk about before we're ready to take on the Gym League's unbelievable drip. The literal dozens of trainer classes. Like we said earlier, the Pokemon games can't lovingly hand draw every random trainer you battle. The very first game had less than half a megabyte of data to work with, so they make categories. They loosely develop a kind of guy you might encounter on your Pokemon journey and then reuse that sprite art throughout the game. And there are over 250 Pokemon trainer classes. That would not be a fun video to watch, so we're gonna take a bird's eye view and look at trends so we can really nail down what they say about Pokemon fashion design. The thing I love about trainer classes is they kind of codify where the Pokemon world doesn't diverge from our own. Even in later generations, this is still where the normies hang out. For every dragon tamer and ace trainer with main character energy, you've got a perfectly average looking engineer who uses electric types, or an ordinary sailor who uses water types, or a pilot with flying types. It's giving elementary school career day, and it's pretty charming. Some of the trainer classes are literally just like humans at a certain age, like the youngster or the gentleman, and some don't have any Pokemon references in their character model besides the fact that they're holding a Pokeball like the rich boy or the office workers. Bonus points if the ball's in the air like the psychic. I love that the categories of dude range from like a person wearing a bathing suit to like an Omega level mutant controlling things with their mind. The psychic models in specific illustrate a major, if obvious, factor in what I'm calling flamboyance drift over the generations. Simply, the graphics got better. Going with a white lab coat for Gen 1 makes a lot of sense for the franchise's early obsession with unethical DNA testing, but it also means the visual execution isn't distractingly off the mark. This then evolves into something closer to a stylized karate gi, which goes even further to a kind of sci-fi version of this. And then later a sci-fi gi with the lab coat. Of course the outfits got more complicated. The franchise no longer had to fit in a microscopic bite economy in a monochrome unbacklit screen. Ken Sugimori is one of the absolute titans behind this world. He personally designed the vast majority of what I'm talking about in this video, and his watercolors are playful and bright and cartoonish. They translate into game sprites pretty directly, which is an interesting contrast to a game like one of my all-time favorite titles, Final Fantasy VI. Yoshitaka Amano's illustrations for the early Final Fantasy games are famously impressionistic and evocative, and were adapted down into the 16-bit versions you play as. Final Fantasy VI and the games before it used these full illustrations as a jumping-off point for the in-game models, not a direct visualization. So early Pokemon doesn't quite have the same gulf between concept art and game sprite, which I think speaks more to different intentions for the role these illustrations play in game dev. But there is still a great deal more complexity in Ken's watercolors than his game models, and I find it fascinating the way older Pokemon designs try to evoke a sense of depth and implied complexity with limited graphics, while these newer designs try to evoke a sense of simplicity in the garments with their more advanced graphics. Some of my favorite Pokemon trainer class designs are somewhere in between normal guy fashion and full Pokemon horse girl mode. A common move is adding an extremely overt Pokemon reference on an otherwise normal outfit, like the Pokeball suspenders on Gen 9's Youngster, or the Pikachu sculpture in Gen 8's Artist, or one of my top favorites, the Pokefan. I just absolutely love these sprites so much, and they perfectly illustrate the next factor contributing to flamboyance drift, that the franchise's growing fame in our world directly contributed to an increase in self-referentialism in-game. In Generation 1, there was no global media phenomenon to cite. These characters lived in a world where the Pokemon merch boom hadn't happened yet. In Generation 2, we get some Pikachu paraphernalia because anything beyond the world's flagship character would be too niche or overly self-congratulatory, you know? But over the decades, we can see how the designs of these games reference themselves more and more because it makes sense in the game world now, and it makes sense to us. As players, it's not jarring at all. It's kind of fun to look at a preschooler in the game and say, oh my gosh, he's got a little Sableye on his shirt. And I need you to know that Sableye is my #1 favorite Pokemon. And I am fighting the urge to info dump more about my son. And yeah, plot twist, if you pull off the Scooby-Doo mask, it's capitalism. Over 60% of Pokemon's revenue comes from merchandising. So of course they want to show you all the cool Pokemon clothes they wear in Pokemon games. Them's the breaks, they want to sell you stuff. And we'll talk more about that increased self-referentialism as we move into the Gym League next. But before we go, I've got to give props to the channelers and the Hex Maniacs. This game's wonderful ghostly girlies who act like possessed before you defeat them. I love these designs so much, even if I'm not intentionally pulling from them for this build. No one is wrong to notice the similarities between them. To me, that just means that there's a strong visual design language for ghost types. I'm not directly using these designs as inspiration because the Gen 1 channelers are obviously just Shinto shrine maidens, and it seemed like a pretty cut and dry, bad, disrespectful move to turn religious dress into a costume. And the Hex Maniacs don't show up until Gen 3, when I'm trying to keep my design references focused on Gen 1. So let's get back to that design and start figuring out that shawl. Luckily, I've got a good starting point. This shawl was the only part of the entire cosplay that I designed fully knowing the fabric beforehand. Because I knew that I had this quilted cotton jersey left over from my Not the Brave cosplay that I made back in 2019. It's what I used for her sweatpants jumpsuit, and I knew the texture and the heathering of the gray was going to be an incredible fit for this build. And as I got closer to the dates of KatsuCon, the event that I was using as my strategic hard deadline to get this thing wearable, the shawl was kind of the thing that I, strategically left until the last hot minute. This was the absolute last thing that I sewed. I sewed this at 1 in the morning when I needed to be awake at 6 to catch my train. Because I knew I could get away with it being 2 rectangles with a diagonal seam. That's it. That's all it is. And then on Thursday night in the hotel room, I rolled over the raw edge and tacked it down with a quick and wide whip stitch. The pointy end of this little triangle seam here in the back was just safety pinned into the waistband for KatsuCon. But I am gonna hand sew a big ol' whopper popper on there so I can have a long-term solution. I come from drag, and we call the really big snaps whopper poppers. So right now the shawl is good. It looks good with the rest of the costume. But the whole point of this cosplay project, and the reason why I keep coming back to it even after I sit it down for long periods of time, is because I want to push each and every single piece of this entire ensemble to be better than just good. I want it to be the best it can possibly be. Usually with cosplay, I feel like some of it is the best it could possibly be, or maybe even most of it if I'm really lucky. But rarely, if ever, do I feel like every aspect of a finished project has been fully pushed to its ultimate potential. I originally sketched the edges of the shawl to have prairie points on them because I wanted to find more spots to use this beautiful purple wool that I've pulled into a few other places of this outfit. But now that I've built the shawl, I think that if I sew those on, they're really gonna mess with the slight stretch this fabric has, which is really helpful for getting it to fit properly. And looking back at my handy dandy inspiration board, I can see that a lot of the shawls that I really fuck with have tassels on the edge of them. And the internet is telling me that tassels are a quick 5-minute craft. The internet has never lied to me before. I have crafting stream tomorrow, so I think I'm gonna try and do some tassels on there. If I were smart, I would do some tests today. I'm not smart. I'm probably gonna use that time getting my camera set up a little bit better in OBS. Really want to get a second camera in there. I want to be able to show my hands doing tiny crafts while I can also see my face struggling. A full deluxe streamer experience. I think my patrons deserve it. I stream twice a month on Patreon. Truly, I never thought I would enjoy live crafting as much as I do, and that's 100% because my patrons are really fun to hang out with. The final photos from that shoot I mentioned earlier actually just got delivered a few days ago, and they're up now only for my patrons, so I'm just letting you know it's a good time to join. They're really good photos. Your support on Patreon is the reason why I am able to make videos like this, and I want to say a special thank you to Kristen Neves, Camille Mac Harris, Grace Lilly, Anelic, I'm not sure if I'm saying that right, Phantom Angel 1245, Simrel, Adoilable, Megan Von Ackerman, Joe Burrito, Turson, Tanya Shiba, Maggie Holden, Larzard, Arden Winner, KFry84, and Eli. I also want to say thank you to Ariane Liebrecht, I mispronounced that last time, Lulu Rush Cosplay, Stephanie C, and Hust, and of course an enormous thank you to Thomas Drury Wang and Toria. I just can't say thank you enough. And actually, I also ended up streaming the hand sewing to get these tassels on the shawl itself. It's all happening over there. Hand tacking these down means there aren't any visible seams where the tassels attach, which is my top priority. Extra seams would just take away from how pretty the quilting is, and look how good this turned out. I am absolutely referencing the freaky little tassels that Agatha has in her Let's Go Eevee and Pikachu design. Also, tassels are inherently ghost-shaped. I'm a year and a half deep into this project, and I have yet to hand sew something and regret it after the fact. The next time you're debating on whether or not you're gonna hand sew something, imagine me as the little angel devil on your shoulder being like, you're probably not gonna regret it if you hand sew it. I do need to hand tack down these folds along the shoulder here because I know now, having worn it multiple times, if I don't, it will come unfolded like it just did. I sketched this like a true Sontag shawl with the fronts crisscrossing, but I think I really like this being a rectangle instead of the points of a triangle. Also, for the historical costuming girlies who are watching this and are like, but Lizard, a Sontag shawl is something we see a lot more in the 1860s, not the 1890s, which is what I've been referencing this whole time. Yeah, I know. This bad boy can fit so many decades of historical dress in it. Sometimes the vibe supersedes the rules. I actually did the first pass of gathering down these folds while looking in the mirror and actually wearing the shawl. Shoulder slope can be a really underestimated aspect of getting things to fit correctly, so by fitting this on myself in the mirror, I knew that it was going to lay correctly, and then I can do the rest of really locking it in when it's on the dress form. I was gonna hand tack these folds down so they weren't visible, but I think I have another idea actually. Right now we've got the signature Pokeball shape in this cosplay already, a scalloped trim on the bottom of the skirt, but I think we need something in the portrait zone. So what if I do a quick draft of a Pokeball outline and make it out of this purple wool? I've used this fabric a few times already in this costume for the prairie points on our witch hat and also the Pokeball trim on the skirt itself, but honestly I want a chance for this fabric to really shine. It's gorgeous. So this is just a quick draft of a Pokeball outline. Do you see the vision? This, but in that fabric. I'm definitely gonna need to mess with the shape a little bit. I think using a true circle with the angle you view it at can make it look a little too flat. And I'll probably end up backing this with like a cheap polyshantung I've got lying around. That's what I did for the skirt trim. And this way also I can just machine stitch these pleats down instead of hand sewing them because that hand stitching will be covered up by a little decorative Pokeball design. I'm actually so fucking excited. Let's fucking go. Let's make this. For small pieces like this, hand basting honestly takes just as long as pinning and works better, so I'm just throwing some sloppy stitches on before I sew these funny horseshoes in place. I don't want there to be visible seams, so I'm hand tacking back the pinking sheared edge. And on one last crafting stream hurrah, we're popping these bad boys on there. One of my major design goals with this build was to create moments of high contrast, like the black stripes on light periwinkle shirtwaist, because I always accidentally design looks with lots of variation in color hue, but no contrast in color value, like lights and darks. The easiest way I find to check this is taking a look on your phone with the desaturated filter. But honestly, I don't even need to do that to see the purple and gray are blending in and need some weathering to really pop. Which, yes, is a little in the weeds of color theory, but I want to get in the weeds, or the tall grass, if you will, to talk about Pokemon gym leaders. Because to me, this is the main event. This is why I wanted to make this video. Pokemon gym leader design is peak Pokemon fashion. A gym leader needs to look exceptional. Regardless of their personality or demeanor, they need to communicate to the player that this character means business, and besting them would be an accomplishment. And I think our first generation of gym leaders do a really good job at that part of the equation. But it's the first gen, they haven't yet unlocked the secondary part of the equation we're going to be talking about, which is to visually communicate the type of Pokemon their gym focuses on, out of the 18 types available. I can't dunk on Gen 1 for not doing this to the extent we see later. They're still iconic designs on their own. Lance single-handedly invented the Dragon Tamer aesthetic we talked about earlier. Giovanni is an incredible example of less being so much more for a villain, but my personal favorite is Sabrina with her unbelievably sharp psychic superhero alien fit. And for this section, I'm loosening up a little on whether I'm looking at originals or redesigns or the anime. I'm kind of looking at the whole picture. And yes, don't yell at me about Lance. I'm including the Elite Four and the champions when relevant. I'm just throwing it all in there at this point. And because I need to tell you that Lorelei walked so Mia Fey could run. In Johto, we saw the addition of two new types, Dark and Steel, and the need to define their identity in an already established type economy is a big part of the initial push into that exaggerated elemental fashion that would ramp up later. Gen 2's designs are pretty good for the most part. It's cool they focused on types that didn't get a guy in the previous game, and I kind of love seeing a heinously unremarkable character and being so confused before I remember, oh yeah, right, the normal type exists. Price in the redesign is the obvious winner of this generation for me. You immediately get a sense of this character's chilly demeanor, you see crystal clear ice references, and it's executed with the signature chunky spikes we've come to expect from this world. This is what a great gym leader should be. I mentioned that I haven't played Gens 2 through 5, so doing this research was my first time seeing these characters grouped up by game. And Hoenn's redesigns left me gagged. I'm trying to find a miss in this crew and there simply isn't one. Every single character has clear visual signifiers tying them to their specialty on top of some deliciously criminal name puns. There are references that go past the boundaries of Pokemon, like flying type Winona seemingly drawing from Nausicaa Valley of the Wind. There are really subtle details like the screw heads on Watson's sandals. And of course, Wallace really is that girl. The queer coding is scrumptious, the look is camp, but what I love most about this design is the clear line you can draw from Wallace to melodic. Melodic? Using design elements from individual Pokemon once they have marinated in the collective fandom consciousness is an absolute hallmark of Pokemon design, and Wallace is a killer example of it. When I'm designing cosplays, I love to think about the reality of moving through the world for both me and the character. For me, I ask, where will I put my phone and my con badge in this costume? For the character, I can ask, what everyday items does this person carry? What do they need accessible, and how do they access it wherever they're going? These are great questions to consider as a designer, and at the same time, it's a hallmark of Pokemon NPC design that they don't give a fuck about any of that. These designs are intentionally disconnected from the considerations of everyday reality. Moving on to Sinnoh, what are these things in Cynthia's hair? Why does she put these on in the morning and not like a purse when she rolls out the door to terrorize children? A delightful mystery. I generally found Sinnoh's gym lineup to be fairly weak from a design perspective, so I'm gonna keep it moving. There's only so much I can say about brandless, off-duty Ronald McDonald over here. He's like a royalty-free clowncore enthusiast who needs to keep it business casual for his mid-aughts day job. Unova has its misses as well. I think Caitlin's design is egregious. Who increased hat scale by 50% and how do you put it back? But Marshall is actually my favorite fighting type design in any generation. Grimsley is immediately clockable as dark type, and I love Lenora's apron. It's nice to finally see character models in a skin tone range that reflects the people that actually play this game. Took them long enough to get there. The core game series makes the jump to 3D graphics in Kalos and then Alola, with Alola having an island trial system instead of gyms proper. It's all going in the mix at this point in the video. And Kalos is a perfect illustration of another reason why we got Flamboyance Drift. As designs start to retread old ground, they need to pull from more than a single point of inspiration. Early generations could get away with Steel type as a dress, Bug type as an outfit, but the franchise can't do that forever, so our Bug type leader becomes a photographer. Our Rock type leader becomes a rock climber. This is similar to what I do in cosplay, where I'm not just making Lavender Town the outfit, I'm making Lavender Town as an Edwardian witch. In Alola, we have an electric type computer kid, and one of my favorite designs in this entire franchise, like a duck golfer girly. This is one of the best Pokemon designs I've ever seen because it executes a fairly complex prompt flawlessly. She's giving us preppy sporty vibes with the polo shirt and visor, silly goose color scheme, and classic Pokemon feathery spikes, and the literal flying type icon. Pokemon design at its best should be idiotic. This is another key part of Flamboyance Drift. The more exaggerated something is, the clearer it is. And as we start to get comparatively complex prompts, subtlety is only going to slow us down. The Paldea character designs are also a lovely showcase of these multifaceted character concepts, like an electric type e-girl streamer or a psychic makeup artist. As has been discussed to death on the internet, it's a shame that Gen 9's gameplay is fundamentally not great because so many of the elements going into it are wonderful. Larry is the best normal type trainer in this franchise, but I actually want to wrap up this discussion on the second to last generation, Gen 8, because the Galar designs are something entirely different. In Galar, your gym leaders are all wearing highly abstracted professional athletic uniforms, and I love these designs more than I can put into words. They're across the board the most visually complex designs we have seen from the franchise to date. Each uniform is covered in patterns and iconography, but the combination of such a busy appearance with the constraint of a sports uniform balances out. And because Pokemon has such an established visual language by now, these designs can communicate type specialty with wild visual efficiency and genuinely fun characterization. I can match the type to every single one of these guys, and they all look incredible. But okay, I need to be a little more efficient with this video's runtime because there is one last crucial ingredient in Flamboyance Drift, which we'll get to as soon as we wrap up some rapid fire crafting. After weeks of searching, I finally found what I was looking for. To me, a pince gives a really distinct turn-of-the-century flavor, and once I had the idea, I knew I wasn't gonna rest until I had tracked one down that wasn't like a fucking $100. I finally found a listing for 2 antique pairs of eyeglasses that I'll use for something, and a pince. Wait, look at this case also. Like, it's an actual antique, and I'm using it to dress up like Pokemon. I gotta get these lenses out though, because they are a headache factory. In my experience, when you're cosplaying, it's better not to have lenses in your glasses if you can avoid it, because they can catch on lights in really distracting ways when you're taking pictures. This thing's also definitely gonna need a chain, both for the aesthetic and because I don't want this to pop off and get lost on the con floor. And I have exactly this much left of this really delicate beaded jewelry chain. This is from my stash, and I used up most of it in a prop will cover in a later video. And to be honest, it makes my heart so genuinely happy because I actually harvested this from the only cosplay that I have ever completely destroyed to scrap for parts. When I moved into this studio, I took apart my entire Narcissa Malfoy cosplay so that I could reuse the pieces for other stuff in the future. Just your regularly scheduled reminder that looking back on the stories we loved as children can be complicated and tough. And I very genuinely love being able to repurpose the physical objects that used to hold that love to hold different kinds of love, you know? But anyway, this is just a little amethyst bead from Michael's. I just thought it was cute. It's not all deep. And I made a little wire ear cuff for the chain to attach to with some jump rings. And just like that, our pince is ready to battle some trainers. I'm gonna talk about it in a future video, but I'm also thinking about this eyewear as being a fun reference to the Sylph Scope, which is a key item in the game that allows you to actually see and identify ghosts. There are so many more accessories and tiny props I've got planned for the next video in this ongoing series, but I'm not gonna just leave you hanging right now. I wanna show you what's gotten done up to this point. So what I'm about to tell you is actually kind of a preview for some ongoing projects that'll get much deeper dives later. I've mentioned using Agatha's purple dress, shawl, and apron as jumping off points before, like an outline I'm coloring in. So in January, I made an apron for this build. Here's part of what that process looked like. 65 million years ago, I bought this beautiful brushed cotton that I was planning on using for both the apron and a ruffle at the bottom of the skirt. I do wish I had bought like a half a yard more. I am cutting it a little bit close figuring out this apron. At this point, the fabric I have is the fabric that I have, and I'm just gonna have to figure it out. Initially, I sketched the apron to have a straight waistband, but the more I've worked on this project, I think I really do want it to have a slight point in the center. I don't have anywhere near enough fabric to make the top part one continuous length, so I think I'm going to have the front bit be one thing and the back ties be another pattern piece. I thought about going for a really cartoony anime, like perfect Sailor Scout bow, but I kind of think that for this costume, I want the more realistic bow. I want the I literally just tied these pieces of fabric together to get in this cosplay bow. Something you see in really great design, whether it's from a handheld video game or a fashion plate from the 1890s, is repeating elements in different spots on an ensemble. I used prairie points on the brim of this witch hat, which is a manipulation technique where you fold fabric into a triangle, and I knew I wanted this apron to also have those along its hem. These kind of chunky spikes show up a lot in Pokemon character design in general, and I think they're specifically so reminiscent of Haunter and Gengar. Once the apron was wearable, it got a solid coat of watered down Dynaflow. Coffee and tea dyes are great, but for this project, I preferred to have a little more control over the coloration. I did have a really good laugh at how this looks like a dressy top I would have worn to a school dance in high school. And once it was dry, we needed just one final detail. So it was the week of Katsukan. I knew by now I was going to make it across the finish line with work that I was really proud of, but I'd be without some of my Easter egg props. The things that scream Pokemon in a less subtle way than how I designed my clothes. And even though time was running out and I needed to sew the shawl and pack my suitcase, I decided to take a day and make the most important thing I can include in any Pokemon cosplay. So take it away, February Lizard. I cut some really thin strips of masking tape and put those down along the center of the wood grain. Luckily, with the way these balls are cut, I can kind of tell where the center line is. As long as it looks okay eyeballing it, I'm counting that fine for me. I also got these teensy little buttons that I'm going to use to be like the center circle of the Pokeball. I literally just walked into Pacific Trimming and was like, what is the smallest button I can find here? And then that one was the one that I picked up. These are just taped on so that I can keep in mind that this is what they'll look like for scale. I used Flex Bond to prime this, and I don't even know if that was a good idea. And once the primer had dry, I just slapped on some coats of acrylic. These were really, really thin coats, so they did dry pretty fast, and I was able to pretty much boogie on these in just a few hours, when I definitely should have been packing. I used embroidery floss to get these darling little X's on them, and then I E6000'd them down and chucked them in my suitcase. That's what we had time for this go around. I hand sewed them using some twill tape in my hotel room so that they would attach to the waistband of the apron. This was a very temporary solution for how I'm going to attach these, but for a 1.0 pass, I am very excited about them. And I'll be revisiting more of the apron and the Pokeballs and the dozen other Easter egg props I've made or have planned later on in this series. Not to be intentionally withholding, that's just the reality of how much crafting is in my editing backlog and still ahead of me. But that's all for future Lizard to deal with and future you to enjoy. Present Lizard is going to put on everything we covered in this video and show you how far we've come. Our flamboyance drift of the fashion design in the world of Pokemon is caused by one last crucial factor. It's you. And it's kind of also me. When fans of Pokemon put their creative energy into designing art and characters based on this world, the canon has to keep pace, baby. I realized when I sat down to iron out my thoughts for this that my entire cosplay career doing original design concepts wouldn't exist without Pokemon fan art gajinkas. And the term gajinka refers to a kind of artistic anthropomorphization, turning a non-human design into a human. For me and so many others, Pokemon was the first and most easily accessible inspiration from which I saw artists designing characters and the outfits they wore. When I started this video, I thought I was just looking at the aspect of this franchise that's really interesting to me as a costume designer. But Pokemon itself is completely, entirely predicated on design. Mickey Mouse only needs to be friend-shaped once. They nailed Winnie the Pooh's red t-shirt and they never went back to the drawing board once. But the secret to Pokemon's longevity is the franchise's ability to game after game create new designs that are compelling, even if they aren't always good. It has to continuously reinvent itself while staying true to the nostalgia for childhood adventure at its core, which is a big ask when the fans are already so good at it. Think of how many evolution designs you've seen over the years. Or the Poké Dance trend just a few weeks ago. The official Pokemon channel posted this cute dance video featuring art of trainers from different generations, which was such a cool look at the fashion journey we've been talking about, and then people on TikTok started styling their own versions of what they would wear as gym leaders of a certain type. Turning a more analytical eye to why Pokemon is the way that it is and why we love that keeps revealing the same fundamental truth that I honestly didn't expect to find here too. Pokemon at every step of the journey is creating a sandbox for us to play in. They've built a visual language that is distinctive and flexible and campy as hell. We automatically know what it means to look like a Pokemon trainer, and maybe now we can kind of put into words what that means. There's a reason why artists are still drawing 25-year-old critters in new redesigns, and why we still flock to our screens when official art drops to see each new take on these well-worn concepts. It's the same reason why I've let this build take the time that it needs, and why I wanted these videos to be so much more than just showing you my stitches. Because when we look at the world of Pokemon, what we're really seeing in the self-referentialism and the color story and the flamboyance is where we'd fit in, and what kind of things we'd want to wear in the world of Pokemon. Thank you so much to Milanote for sponsoring this video. Signing up via the link in the description is a fantastic way to help this channel, and thank you to my patrons for making all of this possible. Making these videos where I combine my crafting process with the way my brain experiences media is the most creatively fulfilling thing I have done with my life, and it is an honor to share it with you. If you know someone who'd like this kind of thing, I hope you send this video to them. And leaving a like and a thoughtful comment really helps this video find the people that want to see it. The thoughtfulness is just for me. I like to read them. And if you want to know how the Pokemon show managed to capture lightning in a bottle in 1998 and revisit the first 80 episodes of the anime, you should definitely watch this video, because that skirt was an ordeal. And as for what's coming next in this build, I don't know. I think you guys should prepare for trouble and maybe consider making it double. Until then, stay hydrated, stay weird, and I'll see you in the next one.